Hi there, this is John Wilkinson again from History Made Easier, and this presentation is the first of a series that focuses on the Chinese Civil War. You'll still be able to use some of what I say in dealing with Mao's rise to power, but the emphasis is going to be on the war itself. And remember, in looking at Mao's rise to power, I've also already covered much of the first period or phase of the Civil War. The White Terror, Mao's time in Jinggangshan and Jiangxi, the Long March, and Mao in Yan'an too. And in this episode, I'm going to go back before that first phase to look at how things in China broke down into civil war. But before I do, a few words on potential exam questions I think are necessary. As I've just suggested, and indeed as the first slide showed, the Chinese Civil War has two distinct periods or phases. The first phase, 1927 to 1937, and a second phase, 1946 to 1949. With World War II and the fight against the Japanese getting in the way between the middle of 1937 through to the Japanese surrender in September 1945. Now, if you look at this slide, you will see that often the question will guide you with dates, but it could leave things open, as in the last question I show. If this is the case, you could include both periods in your answer, or focus on just one, but explain what you're doing in your introduction. It can be quite simple, something like, for the purpose of this essay, I will focus on the first phase of Civil War, from 1927 to 1937. Job done. But if you decide to include both phases, make sure you don't spread your answer too thinly. A particular danger, I think, if you're comparing two civil wars. And of course, you cannot treat each phase as two separate civil wars. I think all of that should be clear for you. I certainly hope so, because students in the past have made mistakes around their approaches to these questions that have cost them a lot of marks. Now, causal questions could focus on long-term or short-term causes, or on economic, ideological, political, territorial, or other causes. The key long-term factors for the first phase, or the Civil War as a whole, include the century of humiliation and the continued presence of imperial powers. The power vacuum left by the collapse of the Qing dynasty and the failure of Sun Yat-sen's Republicans to seize the opportunity presented by that collapse, I would say, are short-term factors. Regionalism is a factor, and the era of the warlords underlines this. With regard to ideological and economic factors, I think you want to compare the nationalist Kuomintang program when they were led by Sun Yat-sen to the party led by Chiang Kai-shek. And as far as Mao is concerned, you really want to think about his focus on the peasantry and the land issue. As for political factors, think about a frustrated Chinese Communist Party, knowing they were weaker than the nationalists and being pushed to compromise with the nationalists by Moscow. And again, the change in the nationalists with Chiang as their leader, because he was determined to rid them of the communist threat. With the second phase of the Civil War, clearly the first phase is still legitimate context. You can see it as a matter of unfinished business. Both sides clearly hostile to each other, uneasy, even unwilling to even compromise in order to rid China of the brutal Japanese occupation. And so a foreign presence is obviously still a factor. But with the defeat of Japan, we again have a power vacuum, and clearly the fight for the future of China is back on. So, let's look at the context to the first phase of the Civil War, and I'm going to focus on the century of humiliation, lasting from 1839 through to 1949, that led to the fall of the Qing dynasty, only to continue after its fall. There were the Opium Wars of 1839-42 and 1856, by which Britain forced the sale of opium with all its social consequences on China. And there were the unequal treaties, one-sided treaties, creating over 50 treaty ports and concession areas subjected to Western and in places Japanese control, and where foreign companies were able to operate virtually without restraint, expanding, even monopolizing utilities such as water, gas, electricity, the postal service and public transport, and where European law was enforced and the Chinese were treated as inferiors. It was a form of informal imperialism, whereby instead of imposing direct military and political control, the imperial powers preferred to leave the Chinese emperor tacitly in control, in so doing exposing the emperor as weak and ineffective. The Qing dynasty, financially bankrupt as well as bankrupt in ideas, cooperated with the foreign powers in order to maintain their imperial authority, but the Chinese were bitterly resentful. Then, in two crushing defeats, China lost any influence it had over two of its most important tributary states. The first came in 1884 at the hands of the French, as they secured Vietnam as part of French Indochina. The second major blow, however, and a decisive turning point in Chinese history, still seen by many today as China's most humiliating experience, was at the hands of the Japanese, as China lost all influence over Korea after the crushing defeat in the Sino-Japanese War of 1894. Even with the fall of the Qing dynasty, the humiliation wasn't over. In 1915, Japan inflicted more humiliation with its 21 demands that were accepted by Yuan Shikai, who had seized the presidency of China, and which included exclusive rights in the former German sphere of influence in Shandong, as well as a shared influence with Russia in Manchuria. Japan would also take control of railways and mines and other concessions elsewhere in China. But the most humiliating of the demands was that Japan would have a decisive voice in China's finances, its policing and government affairs, through the appointment of Japanese advisors, only ultimately denied Japan as a result of international pressure from Britain and America. Such impotence, such humiliation in the face of multiple foreign imperialism stimulated a movement for reform so that China could modernize, rid itself of the hated foreigner and restore its sense of pride. But the reform movement was handicapped because it was very small in numbers and it was associated with Western ideas, Western technology, at a time that the West was humiliating China, whilst Confucianism was embedded in Chinese culture to such a degree that any challenge was strongly resisted. All of this meant that whilst the ruling class was losing credibility, continuing to exploit the peasantry whenever they could, But without playing any part in modernizing China and in reforming the political system from above, neither was a potentially revolutionary class developing, bourgeois or proletariat, that could impose change from below, whilst the peasantry, eking out a life of subsistence through their farming, each community struggling in isolation from the rest of the country, was a very weak class too. Now, think of what's about to happen here. The end of a dynasty lasting 268 years. The end of dynastic rule lasting more than 4,400 years, or thereabouts, and the beginning of a republic. That is incredibly significant. But in 1911 there was nothing strong enough to replace it. A power vacuum was almost inevitable. And I'm going to leave it there, in Republican China. It's important context, and I hope you find it useful. I hope you find my website, History Made Easier, useful too. Do please check it out if you haven't already. But for now, I will simply thank you for listening and wish you the very best of luck with your studies. Cheers.